his life?
Well, he came over here in 1877 and bought this 40 acres that we're living on, this homestead right here. Of course, we've increased acreage since then, but it was just 40 acres when he first bought it, and he bought that in October. Then he went back to Canada and used to come over about once a year, and when he had a farm rented over there, but in the slack time over there, he would come over here and work and clear the land. Then in about 1882, he let a contract with two young men, two brothers, McLean, their names were, to get out the timbers off this 40 acres, enough to build a house. Then that was in the October or so. Then he came back the next spring, and they had the logs all out. Then he got them sawed, and he built the west part of our house, which we have now. That was about 1881 or 82, I'm not just sure. And then after he had the house built, he was married in 1870 or 1880, either 2 or 3, and I'm not sure. And in the next spring, or in the fall of 82, I guess it was, a little baby was born, and she only lived 2 or 3 months. I think it was a girl. And then she passed on. Then he and his wife came over here the next spring. Well, he came first and got the house built. And then his wife came over. She was not well, but she came over and stayed 3 or 4 weeks. And with the green wood and all in the house that she was living in, that it was too much moisture. And she'd had lung trouble before that, and then she became worse. And so he had to take her back to Canada, and she died that spring. I think it was about April or May. And then that kind of stopped everything for a few years, and then he started to go. In fact, I would need to go back a few more years, and said when he was a younger man, he was going with 2 girls. And then he chose this one to marry, and then he married her, and then the baby died, and then she passed away. And then he went back and started to go with my mother. She was the other girl that he had went with years before that. And in 1887, September the 28th, he and her were married. And then they came over here, and they made the home from then on. Then in 2.5 years later, my brother was born. 7 years later, I was born. And that was the extent of the family. Then we grew here, and in 1912, in November of 1912, my brother went up north to work in a bank. His name was Haskett Blair. And he worked up there for a good many years. In 1916, my father passed away in May. And then Mother and I kept on with the farm here. And in 1924, my wife and I were married. She was not my wife then, before that. We have 4 children, Elizabeth and Elva Marie, John and Colson. 2 boys and 2 girls, and we're so thankful that they ended up that way, and they have, of course, all have children. So we have a nice family rounded out that way. No, that's right.
Okay. Now, I'd like to ask you another question. I think that before your father came over, so the McTaggarts came over. I understand they were one of the first ones in this neighborhood, anyway, to come over. And I'd like to have a little bit of information just about when they came over and where they came from and who they were and so on. So I'll let you do that.
The McTaggarts, there was 5 brothers and 2 sisters, came over sometime in the middle 1850s. I don't know just when. Then they worked over in Canada for several years at anything they could get to do. I stayed over there maybe 4 or 5 years or so, and then they came over here, two of them, Neil McTaggart and Donald, his brother. They were the two oldest. They came over and looked the land over and thought it was a good place and bought 160 acres apiece, and then went back to Canada and stayed that winter and came back over here in 1861. And their 2 sisters and 3 brothers came with them, and they all bought farms and settled right around here. I remember Neil McTaggart used to like to talk about the old days, and I can remember when I was only a lad growing up, maybe around 16 or in there somewhere, he told me about when they lived in Scotland before they came over to this country, that he and Donald used to peddle milk night and morning. In other words, his folks had about 6 or 8 cows, and they used to milk the cows, fill about 2 pails each one of the boys had, and they'd go down the street. They had customers. They'd come out from the houses with their dishes, whatever they were, and they would measure out whatever they wanted, a couple of quarts or 3 quarts or whatever they wanted, and then they'd go on. They had that to do before they went to school in the morning, also in the evening when they came home from school. So they were industrious. Their parents had taught them always to work and make the best use of every moment that they had. And they sure found that out over here, because when they bought the land, it was all big, solid timber, and they cleared a lot of good many acres and put it all into good farm land. And they got good land. I remember yet one piece that Mr. Neil McTaggart owned, about 24 acres, I would say, and it was in 1932, I think, that they sold it, and it was virgin timber, and they got a wonderful big price for it. For I can remember yet there was some very, very large hard maple and beech trees in there, and ash, and they got a good price for it, and they sold it. Now it is, second growth has come up, but it'll never be like that first growth that once grew up. All right, shut it off if you want it for a minute.
No, when the McTaggarts first came over, this was back in the 1850s, I believe, and transportation would be just a little bit different then than it is now. You couldn't hop on a bus, or you couldn't hop on in your car and come over. So how would they get here, and how'd they happen to get into this part of the country, if you know, and in this type of...
The only way they could get up into this part of the country was come to Port Huron, then take a boat up part way if they wanted to, and then come across trails that had been cut through by the early settlers to where they wanted to come. These McTaggarts used to walk to Forestville, which was quite a ways. It'd be a long ways to walk today, but they used to walk down there to get their provisions and their groceries, go about twice a year, as I understood them, and then they would carry it back on their backs, whatever they had. Of course, they kept clearing, and they always had good gardens, and they took care of their stock. I can remember talking about coming, one would go ahead, that is when they came the first time, when they were coming across from Sarnia to Port Huron, one of their cattle jumped overboard. They had quite a job keeping the other 5 from not jumping out into the water too, but they kept around them and didn't let them jump. And then when they got to shore, the other one followed the boat right over, and so they had the 6 to bring on up. And they told me themselves that when they would come, one would lead one ahead on the trail, and then the rest would just follow single file, and that's the way they brought their cattle. Also, they did not have horses when they first came, but they got a horse later and raised some colts, and then they had their own team later on. But it was several years before they had a team of horses to take them to town. Now, really, they didn't have anything to take to town to sell, because their meat and all was they just raised what they needed for themselves, and cattle about the same. And I remember one time one neighbor telling me that well, it was one of the McTaggarts. He told me that Donald was fattening 6 hogs for them for meat for the next year. And on just the Sunday before they were going to butcher them, they heard a racket out in the pen, and one of them run out to look, and a big black bear had jumped in the pen, and he had killed 2 or 3 of the pigs. And one of them run out with a gun, but Mr. McTaggart was in his way, good Scotch Presbyterian, and he said, "No, sir, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. We shall not kill on the Sabbath day." And so they had to go a little short on meat, but of course they could go to the forest and shoot squirrels or elk or deer or anything that was around at that time. So they made it up that way. But when they had a faith, they stayed right with it.
Okay, now let's switch back over to your mother. And you've been telling me that your mother, you think, was born around 1853, and was she born in Canada?
Yes.
Well, here, I'll give you the microphone. And
Mother was born about 11 miles north and, say, 1.5 miles west of London. Now, that'd be on the west side of London. You'd have to come out. London was quite a good-sized town, but that was about what they figured. They were from London, and she was born there, and their grandfather, Haskett, was born up near Quebec. I have seen pictures, or we have 1 or 2 pictures of the place where he was born, but I don't know. All I know is that it was up around Quebec somewhere. Then, when he got to be a young man, he and his 1 or 2 brothers came down into Ontario because land was a little cheaper, and it was up there around Quebec because it was a newer country, and he settled in there, had this 100 acres, and Mother said there was one brother. She had one brother, James, older than her, but she was the second oldest of the family, and she said her and Uncle James were born in the old house that used to be down near the creek somewhere, because they used to get the water from there, but then they built the present house that they raised the rest of the family, and they all grew up in. They built that. Mother was born in 1853, so I expect the new house was built about 1855. And there was 4 brothers and 4 sisters in her family. What else now? When Mother was over here, came in 1887, right after they were married. They came over the next day. Then, as she grew up and had her own 2 children, then she was what we might call a midwife, and she went around the whole neighborhood here, and there were some families of 5 and 6 children that I knew that she was always there when the children were born. She had a little satchel. I knew that when I'd see her getting that ready, putting a few things into it. I knew what was coming. She was going to be away for a day or maybe a day and a half over at this neighbor's where they were expecting a child. And she done that for years. And many of the children that was around this neighborhood, Mother was a midwife when they were born. And she really enjoyed the work and thinking that she could just do something to help somebody. In them times it was very hard. You called a doctor, he came out if he could. If he couldn't, why, he didn't get here. And only horse and buggy was the way they go. Never thought of anything like a hospital then. If you went to the hospital, why, you was just on your last legs, as you might say, and because only those that were very bad went, and then, of course, some of them passed on, and then that got a kind of a bad name.
Okay, now, you've been supervisor here in this township, Sheridan Township, since 1954, is that right? 1954, this is 1978, and when we're making this recording, why, you're still supervisor and still working away at your books here. Okay, now, your father was also supervisor, as I understand it. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, he was supervisor at different times. At them times, they very seldom kept any one officer in office over 2 or 3 years. They thought they changed them around until they didn't get so many friendship. But Father was in about 8 years altogether in the several times that he was in. Sometimes it was only for 2 years, and one time it was for 4 years. But he served that many years. I served 4 years as township treasurer from 32 to 36, which was right in the midst of the Depression, and it was very inconvenient, as you might say, but it was a trying and yet it was a challenging job to do, because people wanted to pay and just didn't have the money during the Depression to pay.
Okay, now, you told us earlier a little bit about when the house was built and the fact that only part of the house was built originally, right? And I think it was on a different location even.
Yeah, it used to be about 4 rods west. The house originally sat about 5 rods west and 4 rods north of where it presently sits. There's a big maple tree out there, and it was just west and a little wee bit north of that tree. Aunt M, Mother's second youngest sister, was over here the next spring after her and Father were married, and her and Father had gone back to the woods with the oxen and a dray, what we used to call, and as she was coming up at noon, she reached over and pulled up a little tree that was just little maple, soft maple tree that was probably 4 or 5 feet high, and she hung onto it as the oxen went along, and it came right out, roots and all. And when she got up here, she planted it in the ground about 10 feet each way, east and south of the house. And that tree is still standing out here, so I know how old it is, or very close. No, since it was there, 1887.
Okay, well then when that tree was planted there, the house was still over on its original location? Okay, now let me ask you. When was the house moved back then? Or moved where it is now?
The house was moved over here in 1892, and our dining room and kitchen were built onto it at that time. They moved it over here. The basement is under the kitchen and dining room only. There's no kitchen, there's no basement under the front room or bedroom.
Okay, well, that gives us a little idea about the house. The house is in pretty good shape here, sitting here yet. You were born in it, right?
Yeah.
You were born in the house, okay.
My brother and I were born here.
Okay, your brother and you. And we got a lot of other buildings out around the yard here, and I'd be a little bit interested in knowing, let's take the barn, and tell us a little bit about when the barn was built, as far as you can recollect.
Well, I don't remember it, but I know by sayings and by writings I have, the barn on this place was built the next spring after Mother and Father were married, 1888. Now, Mr. Robson, that lived a mile east here, John Robson, he and Father went to school together over in Canada, and he came over and bought that farm and lived there, and of course they knew each other in Canada, and when they came over here, then that first winter they were married, they got out the timbers, enough for our barn here and enough for Mr. Robson's barn down there. Mr. Robson's barn was burnt last summer, so it's one of the old buildings that was in, but that's how old it was.
Summer of 77, that would be.
1788.
Yeah, I know when it burned.
Yeah. So 88 is when it was built.
Okay, when it was first built, then it was built right low to the ground, and the stables would have been up where our mows are now, where the hay mows are now, right?
That barn was raised and a wall put on it in 1909. There were several barns around here. Alec McTaggart's up here at the corner, and James McTaggart, where Russell now lives, and Neil McTaggart across from our place, just a little west. The old barn is all burnt years ago and gone, though, but it was raised and a foundation or a basement put under it in 1902. Ours was raised here and put a wall under it in 1901. Seems though I have all these numbers in my head and I can get them together. I'm positive they're right.
Okay, well then before the barn was raised, though, there would have been a lot less room in it. Up where we have hay mow now, a lot of it would have been stable. It was just about double the room in it. for your stable and a lot more. And now you don't need the room for hay so much, but that's the way it goes. Well, there's a couple other buildings out here. Just out of curiosity, do you know about the garage and the chicken coop and so forth?
The silo and the garage were both built in 1914. The hen house was built in 1894, I think. I'm pretty sure that's when it was. That, and the silo in 1914.
Yeah, that takes care pretty well of the buildings. No, okay, a little more here.
The farm over to the back and then out to the west road that we own, that barn was built in 1880, and the house was built before that. McPhail's were the people that owned it. Dan McPhail and his brother Neil. And Neil never married, Dan did, and they had one daughter, Mary. And then we bought that in 1936. Mrs. Mary married a name of Fred Ellis, and they kept it until about 1932, and then they traded it or sold it anyway to a man in Cass City, and he and his wife came out there and lived till we bought it from them.
Okay, I'll change the subject a little bit and just talk a little bit about times as you remember them in those days. Now, this you can remember back probably to something like 1902. I know you were born in 1897, right? So you were 3 years old at the turn of the century. And I would imagine you can recollect back when you were 5 or 6 years old, something like that. Now, what I'd be interested in, a little bit about life, I guess, in those days, and what did they do to make a living? What kind of crops did they grow then, and where did they sell them? And then did they more or less provide for themselves? I'm talking about your folks now or neighbors around.
The first white beans that was grew in Huron County were grew in Sheridan Township about 1896 or 7, right in that time anyway. Mr. Angus O'Hanley Sr., there was 2 Angus O'Hanleys, but this was the oldest brother, and he grew the first beans that was grew in Huron County, and from then on, they took them a few years, of course, to spread, but then they have went all over the county to where they are the main cash crop of the county as far as any one crop is concerned. Now, these were O'Hanleys that lived about 1.5 miles north of us here. There was 5 brothers in that family and a couple of sisters, and they were very industrious and good, real good neighbors. I can remember Mother telling about old Mrs. O'Hanley. She was the mother of this family. I don't remember Mother ever speaking of her, but I think that probably her husband had died years before that. I don't think my mother ever saw him. But the family were very hospitable and very neighborly, always willing to help. That is the way that America grew great, helping one another and never thinking of selfish ideals first, always willing to give and to help someone else, no matter if they did have more than you did. If they needed a little help or needed something, always help them out. The McTaggarts, the O'Hanleys, and the Haleys were another old, and the McIntyres were old settlers that came in here about the time McTaggarts did, if I remember right. That would be about 1860 or 61. And they were all good Christian men and women and had their own faiths of whatever they wanted to go to church. They went there. The first Sunday my mother was in Michigan. She went down to what's called the Fraser a Protestant church, Presbyterian church, I might say, that's up here to the corner to 53, then 4 miles south. The same church still stands there. It's been remodeled a couple of times, but Mother used to say it was the same church that she went to the first Sunday they were here. And she walked all the way down there to church. And then when they were coming home, Mr. Beatty, he'd walk down there too, and he just insisted that they come into his place for dinner, for supper rather, I guess you would call it. And so he made out it was just a little ways east of the corner. But Mother said it was 3/4 of a mile the time she walked down there, and then walked back, and then walked home. She thought it was the longest walk she'd ever made, and I guess probably it was up to that time.
Okay. I've heard you tell about, when you were just a boy, about going to town out here in the wagon and peddling milk, I guess, or eggs and butter and so forth. I don't know, and firewood and so on. You want to tell just a little bit about that, about when that would be and how you do that? Was that part of your income, or?
Yes, it sure was part of the income. Of course, I'm talking about when I was just a boy and Father was trying to operate the farm. He was not very well. He hadn't been well for years, and at times he was far from being well, but he kept on managing and trying to go. And then after my brother left, it made it a little bit harder, but I had to kind of buckle in when I was only about 13 or 14 to do the plowing and harrowing and such like. I still done it and was glad to do it. And now I look back and I'm so thankful that I did. But the cash crop was wheat and beans. My father never liked beans very good. Can't tell you why, but he never did. He never grew very many of them. He did grow some of them. But wheat was his choice crop as a cash crop, and we always had a field or two of that so we could sell that to make our money or pay our taxes or whatever other debts that accumulated during the year. But also Mother and Father always milked from 8 to 10 cows. And then Mother made butter. They always separated the milk, and Mother made butter. And for years, as long as I can remember back, when I was only 4 or 5 years old, every Saturday morning, Mother had her routs in Bad Axe, people that took butter from her and took eggs. She always raised about 125 chickens for every year, and she would go in with everybody's butter in a little crock by itself, and she knew which one went which and how many dozen eggs they wanted. They would usually tell her from one week to another how many she wanted, but if they wanted a few more, she always had a few more out in the buggy. I would hold the horse, and she'd go in and deliver her eggs and butter. And I remember yet many, many times, old Dr. Harrington, that's Dr. Ken and Harrington's grandfather. He was the main doctor here, and that was the last stop we had. We always kind of delayed that. I don't know why, but that's the way it was down at the East End, and that's the last stop we had. Mother delivered the eggs and butter in there, and then we'd always go over to the office, which was right next to his house at that time, and Mother knew what it was, and just as soon as she'd go in, he'd see her, he'd just call her in against head anybody else. Some didn't like it very good, but it only took a minute because he just paid her what the eggs and butter was going to bring for that day, and then we went right on out, and somebody else came into his office for their checkup. But them were days, and then we had a little corn, sometimes more than what we needed for the feed, and of course that was always ready market for that. They weren't too high, but every dollar always counted, and we always knew where every dollar went to. Old account books that my mother and father had, they'd put down every little, it's only 10 cents per candy, as we might say, or anything. That always went down as expense. It was counted right in, and every income, too, was always counted. And then along in 1st of January. That was long before income taxes. Why, they could tell you right to the penny how much they took in and how much they spent that year and how much more they had. Another thing, not that our folks ever had a lot of money or anything, but many of the neighbors around here, if they'd want to borrow a little money for a time, 6 or 8 months or a year, not much longer than that, why, Mother and Father would always have the money, and they would lend them out $200 or $300 or more if they wanted to buy a team of horses, we might say. They didn't have enough to pay for them. They had to pay cash. They'd come down. And I can remember many times our folks loaning a little money like that to help them out. And of course, then they got more interest than they would in the bank, but it was cheaper than what they could borrow from the bank. So they used to often come here and borrow some money. Not that I'm trying to say we had a lot, because we didn't, but we did have enough, and we always were willing to share. And we were taught that from the time we were up. Always share with anybody who needs something else.
We're going to ask you another question and maybe change the subject here again a little bit. But I know that back in the 1910, in that era, of course, every place you went, why, you went in a horse and buggy or a horse and cutter, a horse and wagon, something like that. And, of course, Henry Ford down Detroit down Dearborn was starting to crank out the cars, the Model T cars, and I suppose a few dealerships got in around here, and a few people started getting them, and I can remember you telling me about you got Model T Ford about 1916, and tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, in the summer of 1916, I kind of got the fever. I wanted a car. Father had passed away in May before that. Mother wasn't too enthused over it, but when she seen I was kind of wanted one, she said, all right. Well, we had 4 nice steers out in the pasture, just grass-fed, but they were good ones, I will say that. Mr. I can't think of his name right now, a cattle buyer anyway, came along and offered Mother $90 a piece for the 4, which come to $360. And we get a new car, Ford, for $360, and then $10 to bring it up, which was $370. So we scraped together the other 10 and sold the cattle. And
that dealership in Bad Axe?
No, it was Nubley. Then the Fords were divided in districts, and you had to buy in the district in which you live. And here in Sheridan Township, you had to go to Ubley to buy your car. So I went over to Ubley one day and talked to the guy. That'd be about last of July. And he said, yes, I'm getting a list here. He said, and if you want to put your name on the list, why, he said, when your turn comes up, we'll go out and see you. And if you're still interested, we can take it. If not, why, of course, there's always somebody else. So I put the name down then, and it was about around the 16th of September. Man drove in the yard one morning, and he had a new car. It looked like it, all right, out in the yard. So Mother and I went out. Yes, he said he had just come up from Detroit. They'd been driving up all night, and I think they'd made several stops on the way to quench their thirst, and he was polished good, of course, and I don't remember his name at all, but anyway, Mother kind of looked at it, and there was some scratches on it, and she kind of said something about it, and he said, well, lady, there's 10 more men waiting in Ubley to take this car. Any one of them will take it. If you don't want it, just let me know, and I'll take it back and have no trouble taking it, and then your name will go down to the bottom of the list again. Well, I was disappointed, and Mother looked at me, and she said, no, I guess we'll take it. And, well, he said, when do you want to settle for it? And she said, we'll meet you out at the bank at Bad Axe. That was the State Savings Bank at that time. On the corner there, we'll meet you there right around 1 o'clock. So we drove out to Bad Axe at 1 o'clock. We're out there at 1 with a horse and buggy. And she went in the bank and took care of our business. And when he came along, I told him she was inside, and he went in, and she paid him the $370, and I brought home the new car, and Mother brought home the horse and buggy.
Did he teach you how to run it, or how did you know?
I did not know. I'd never drove a car a mile, or he didn't teach me. He just said, this brake is this, and this lever is that, and go ahead and take your time. Don't go too fast. And that's all the instructions I got.
The road was sand road?
The road was practically all sand road at that time, from, well, maybe gravel, but nothing else. And you didn't go very fast. And of course, when you got a little faster than what the old horse used to go, it seemed you was just pretty near flying. So I didn't go too fast, of course, but I drove home carefully and had no trouble, and I never had any trouble with it. And I remember the next spring, Alec McTaggart, that used to live across the road from us, they were getting a new car, and he was to get it at the bank in Bad Axe. That's where they had their money, and he was going to pay for it and get the car. And so he asked me if I'd take him out and kind of show him how to drive it. Well, I said, well, if I drive out my car, I'll have to drive mine home. But he didn't. I don't know. I just forget now how we got out. But we didn't take our car, and we drove out there. And he got his new car, and it was a Buick. And the fellow showed me how to drive it. And then on the way home, I drove it partway out of town, and then I let Alec drive and kind of instructed them on the way home. And that's all the instructions that Alec got for driving their new car. And I remember that I think the Fords were $370, and I think the Buicks, if I remember right, sold for about, they were just a 4-cylinder car at that time, 4-door, 2-seated, and a top that let up and let down, but you had to do it by hand, of course. But they, I think they were around $480 or $90. But Alec got the car, and he never had any wrecks, so I don't know whether I was an expert driver to tell him or not, but anyway, we have drove all these years, and I've never happened to have any bad accidents, but of course I have the experience afterwards. But he never taught me a thing about how to drive it or anything. Never let me drive it till I got in, come home. He told me I had to crank hours, and I pulled up the lever. He said where to place the levers, and then pull up on the crank, choke it, pull up once, and then choke it the next time, and then choke it the next time. But as you get the putting her up, I shoved the choke in, and that's what I did, and away she went. And our old car used to be always a very good start. Never had any trouble with it at all, but some did. And then following that, we kept that for quite a few years, and then we got a Ford Coupe, and drove that a few years, and then we traded off and got a
Ford Coupe was what year? You got that about
well, the first Ford Coupe was a used one I bought, and Art Robson bought our touring car. He gave me $100 for it. It was about 5 years old then, and I bought this used coupe. But this used coupe, it had, I think, hard usage before we got it, because it never was too satisfactory, and so Mother said, no, we're going to get a new one about a year later. So then we got it we got it in March, I think, and a year from that, July, we got a new one.
1922.
Yes, and we always had good luck with any cars that we bought were new, because they weren't abused before we got them.